Christianity wasn't created by Jesus, but by a Jewish tent maker from Turkey. I'm Gilad. I write about Hebrew and Jewish history.
And I'm Kevin Betton, Christ follower, urban apologist, and defender of the Christian faith.
Paul of Tarsus never met Jesus in his lifetime.
You talk fast, but I listen slow. Jesus is still living. Your statement is assuming that Jesus has a lifetime that has ended. Furthermore, there is no biblical or extra biblical evidence that demonstrates that Paul did or did not meet Jesus during his 3-year pre-resurrection ministry. What we do know for a fact is that Paul encountered a resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. This is recorded by Paul's traveling companion, Luke, in Acts chapter 9. Luke records Paul's own account to a Jewish crowd in Acts 22 and before King Agrippa in Acts 26, 12 through 18. Paul also records his own conversion in chapter 1 of his epistle to the Galatians. So to say Paul never met Jesus in his lifetime is conjecture at best and lacks any supporting evidence.
He was a devout Jew who initially persecuted the early followers of Jesus until around 35 CE, when he had a mystical vision that changed everything.
Once again, you talk fast, but I listen slow. A mystical vision is a spiritual experience that carries the connotation of being spiritually symbolic in nature and obscure in meaning, like a dream, a trance, or some religious ecstasy. That is absolutely not how Paul or Luke recounted Paul's encounter with the resurrected and glorified Jesus Christ.
While Jesus and his disciples preached a form of Judaism that required circumcision, keeping kosher, and following Jewish law, Paul created something entirely new.
Paul didn't create anything entirely new. Jesus instituted the new covenant with his death, burial, and eventual resurrection. This new covenant was instituted by Jesus himself, who, according to Matthew's gospel, then commissioned his own disciples to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe everything he had commanded. Mark 16 and 20 records that they obeyed and went out and preached everywhere. Luke records in Acts chapter 2 that even prior to Paul's conversion, Peter preached to 3,000 at Pentecost. In Acts chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, Jesus is preaching the gospel in Solomon's colonnade. Acts chapter 4 and 4 says 5,000 who heard the message believed. Acts 4 and 33 says the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection. Acts 5 and 14 says believers were added to the Lord in increasing numbers. Something verse 42 says that every day that they were in the temple and in homes teaching and proclaiming the gospel, that Jesus is the Messiah. All of this happens before Saul is even mentioned in the text. So no, Paul didn't institute something new. He continued preaching the same gospel message that thousands had already heard and believed.
Paul's revolutionary idea was that Jesus' death abolished the need to follow Jewish law. He promoted a religion open to non-Jews without requiring conversion to Judaism.
Another lie. Paul records in his own words in Galatians 2 that he went to Jerusalem and met privately with those who were recognized as leaders, which according to verse 9 were James, Peter, and John. Paul met privately with Jesus' own brother and 2 of his closest disciples and presented to them the gospel he was preaching to the Gentiles. He states that he wanted to be sure that he was not running in vain. Paul records that they added nothing to him and recognized that he had been entrusted with the gospel for the Gentiles, and they gave him the right hand of fellowship. So there goes any idea of a revolutionary gospel. Furthermore, in the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, Luke records that Peter, in verse 7, affirmed that the gospel was available to the Gentiles. James stated that the prophets agreed and quoted Amos chapter 9 as evidence. Finally, it was the Holy Spirit's decision not to burden Gentiles any further by attempting to get them to follow Jewish law. So once again, the text disagrees with your opinion.
In his letters, which are the earliest Christian texts we have, written 20 years before the Gospels,
that's disputed. There are some scholars like Douglas Moo, Luke Johnson, and Dan McCartney who argue that it's possible that James' epistle was the earliest of the New Testament letters. We simply don't know for sure, and we definitely don't know for sure enough to be dogmatic about it.
Paul established key Christian concepts absent from Jesus' teaching: original sin, salvation through faith alone, and Jesus as a divine being who existed before creation.
Original sin, the belief that we are born sinners and sinners by nature, isn't rooted in Paul's teaching. It's rooted in the entire biblical teaching, beginning with the fall in Genesis 3, and is seen consistently throughout the Bible in passages like Genesis 8:21, Job 15:14, Psalms 14:2-3, Jeremiah 17:9, and Ecclesiastes 9:3. It's the whole reason that Jesus came, because of our sinful nature. Faith has always been the means by which salvation has come. James teaches that Abraham was justified by faith before the law came. And finally, Jesus repeatedly taught that he was God. James 2:19 records that God is one, just as John's gospel would later record Jesus saying in chapter 10, verse 30, I and the Father are one. Paul's letters are definitely some of the earliest writings on these subjects, but what matters is whether or not it is true. Because his writings were early doesn't mean that they were erroneous or fabricated. If Paul had written something Jesus did not teach, surely Jesus' disciples and his brothers would have corrected Paul in their writings, which were subsequent to his, but they never do.
The Jerusalem church, led by Jesus' brother James, and including Jesus' original disciples, strongly opposed Paul's interpretation.
No! 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 No!
And where is this in the text? You see how he just says it and expects for you to take his word for it, but provides absolutely no evidence for his claims. Again, we've already demonstrated that Paul met James, John, and Peter in Jerusalem and confirmed the content of his preaching with them. And this is recorded by Luke.
But history sided with Paul.
History sided with truth. It sided with Paul, Peter, James, John, Matthew, Luke, Jude, and the author of Hebrews, who all taught the same doctrine. Not one New Testament letter opposes Paul's teaching. Not one.
When Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Jewish Christian movement was decimated.
Once again, listen slow. Jewish Christian movement? There is no such thing. Judaism and Christianity are not the same. Judaism was a religion. Christianity, a movement. One that grew and had already spread throughout the entire Roman Empire, just like Jesus said it would in Acts 1:8. From Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. Rome banishing the Christians from out of Jerusalem just gave the gospel even more reason to spread further.
While Paul's Gentile churches flourished across the Roman Empire, the Christianity we know today, with its focus on Jesus' divine nature and salvation through faith, is Paul's creation, not Jesus.
Mischievous and deceitful, chicanerous and deplorable.
Yeah, and he presents no evidence to support this claim, as we've already seen. Just more trust me bro theology from people who want to sow seeds of doubt in your mind.
Now you know.
We know that you're mistaken, lacking evidence, and likely intentionally leading people astray.